Hi everyone. Today's speaker is going to be Assistant Professor Holly Jones, as Sean's introduced her earlier. And in a pre-COVID reality, the plan was for Holly to be giving you this talk in person in the Goddard building down in room 257 or whatever it is, as Holly was going to come and visit me for a collaborative research visit, as Holly and I co-supervise a student looking at island conservation and island restoration. So Holly is an amazing researcher. We're really privileged to have her here today. She's an expert, highly published in seabird, island conservation and other things, as she alluded to in her own introduction. She works in prairie restoration, she works on bison, so plus a range of other things, but some pretty charismatic species there that Holly works on. Holly's also, I've known Holly, I first met Holly, I think, in person back at a ICCB conference in Auckland, and she's always been someone that I've admired for her amazing research, and also that she has actually published single author papers, which I think is an amazing feat in itself in this day and age. So well done, Holly. I was always intimidated by your ability to do that. And Holly's also a vocal advocate for gender equity in STEM, and anyone who follows her, you can see her Twitter handle there. She often is retweeting some really interesting content around gender equity, and she's also part of maybe the only person or part of the collective responsible for Fem Field Studies, which is a field guide for doing field work for women in STEM. So a really amazing woman who achieves a lot in her time. And I would advocate that the way Holly and I have the collaboration that we work on now came out of a Twitter conference. So it was a really amazing opportunity that arose from a Twitter conference. So if you see something interesting on Twitter, you should reply, put your paper in it, have a conversation and follow up with someone, because amazing things happen, which is what's happening with Holly and I now with our collaboration. So Holly, take it away.
Woo! All right. Well, thanks, Justine. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I will try to live up to that wonderful introduction. And at some point, we should talk about why I have first author papers. Maybe someone should ask me that in the questions, because I'm not sure they're deserved, but that's fine. Okay, so when Justine invited me to talk, I thought about just presenting just the Seabird Island stuff that Justine was alluding to, but I thought, oh, I might as well tell you sort of about my broader research program. So this talk is going to be sort of light in details and heavy on sort of the wide variety of topics that my lab studies. And I'm really excited to get to talk to you all. I really wish it was in person. At some point, we should make that happen, and hopefully we can have a beer together. That'd be great. Okay, so when I tell people that I work on islands, I think most people picture something like this. Beautiful sand beach, perhaps an umbrella drink, just dipping your toes in the sand. But I just want to I just want to get us out of this picture and sort of more focused on the reality of my fieldwork, which looks a little bit more like this. So when you get to a seabird island, which I'm going to define here in a little bit, your sort of senses are just assaulted. The first thing that you smell, if that island's never been invaded by invasive mammals, is just ammonia wafting off the place. And that's because there are usually thousands to millions of seabirds breeding on it. They're often also quite steep, and so it's not as relaxing as it sounds. And in fact, speaking of sounds, you also get assaulted by this at night when you're trying to sleep. Yeah, so that's how it sounds at night when you're trying to get some sleep on these seabird islands I work on. And at this point, I may not be convincing you that anyone should really be working on these islands. So I want to tell you about why I think they're really important to study. I wonder if any of you recognize this picture at all. I only see like 3 of your faces, and none of you are shaking your heads yes. But this species is a species of snail that we just lost last year, went extinct last year. It was called Lonely George after Lonesome George, the Galapagos Island tortoise. And the loss of this snail from the earth forever sort of underscores the that we are at the height of a biodiversity crisis, and that we're losing species a lot faster than we've ever lost them before. And that's why I work on these islands. And that's because islands have high levels of endemism and have high levels of extinction. So they're really these both biodiversity and extinction hotspots. So if we can get conservation right on islands, we have this great opportunity to have an outsized effect on the biodiversity crisis as a whole. And you know, biodiversity is super important. Not only does it get us out in nature and studying it as scientists, but it also does a whole host of things for us, including pollination services, aesthetic beauty, and a whole host of other things. Sadly, we are losing species faster than we've ever lost them on Earth, and we're in this biodiversity crisis. And the good news is that people like you and like me have been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to stem this loss. And sort of two categories that people use to stem biodiversity loss include the idea of preservation. So this is the biodiversity hotspot map. I can't believe it's 20 years old now. I feel super duper old. But the idea behind biodiversity hotspots is that we preserve those areas of nature and we can preserve a lot of the world's biodiversity and sort of let it go about its business unencumbered by disturbance from people. And the second way is restoring damaged ecosystems. And this map from the World Resources Institute shows the global potential of restoring forests worldwide, with colors being relatively bigger or smaller opportunities to restore. And globally, it's over 200 million hectares, or bigger than the land area of China, that has a good opportunity for restoration. You can imagine that if it was sort of the opportunities to restore all ecosystems on Earth, the entire map, including the marine ecosystems, would be a light in color. And even in the context of biodiversity hotspots, restoration is important, because to be included as a biodiversity hotspot, around 70% of the plants habitat have to have been affected somehow. So the approaches of preservation and restoration really go hand in hand, and they're sort of more on a spectrum. And I like to sort of place my research more on the restoration end of that spectrum, though my research sort of overlaps both sides. So the sort of three main thrusts of my research program are as follows. The first is, how can biodiversity contribute to restoration and human well-being? So we know that nature can work for us, but I'm interested in trying to understand how restoration can be harnessed to help people, especially in the realm of climate change. And then second, the second thing that my lab studies is how ecological theory can be used to guide restoration efforts. So restoration is a super new science, and while ecological theory sort of underpins much of the restoration that goes on, I think that we can do a better job of using ecological theory to benefit restoration. And so that's what's going on as a portion of my lab's studies. And then lastly, I'm also interested in understanding how biodiversity and ecosystem functioning recover following disturbances. Information about this can help us prioritize our restoration efforts where they're needed, where they might not be, and help us get the most bang for our conservation dollars. So I'm going to sort of walk through 4 parts of this talk that cover the 3 parts of that restoration, or of my research program. And these are the 4 parts, and I don't want anyone to panic when I get to the 4th part and I don't have very much time left. I'm going to talk to you about prairies like super briefly. I'm not going to show you any of the methods or anything. I'm just going to talk about prairies briefly, and y'all can ask me about it afterwards if you're really excited about prairies like I am. Okay, but first let's jump into ecosystem-based climate change adaptation, and that's sort of the human well-being component of the research that my lab pursues. So in this first collaboration, and throughout, by the way, I'm going to have these like intro slides so that I don't have to have the last slide where I have 17,000 people and funders. So that's why I have these intro slides. But for this component, I was working with Conservation International to try to identify where ecosystems can help people adapt to climate change. And specifically, I was interested in coastal-based climate change. And the name of nature protecting people from climate change effects is called ecosystem-based adaptation, or nature-based solutions. That was brought up in the tea break there. The idea of EBA, which I'm going to say rather than saying that mouthful every time, is that we can use nature to help protect people from the adverse effects of climate change. And the cool thing about EBA options is that they're often more cost effective than these hard engineered solutions that are often put forth by people. So I have an example here of the New York City watershed. So the Catskills are the watershed above New York City. And New York City makes a really smart financial choice because they pay $150 million per year for the people of the Catskills to use them in a way that preserves that watershed, and that cleans a lot of, that means that New York receives a lot of clean water. On the other hand, if they wanted to build a water treatment plant, that water treatment plant would cost $6 to $8 billion up front and then $30 million a year to maintain. So this is what I mean by more cost effective. And the coastal sort of part of this is that if you build a seawall, it often costs more money than preserving the mangroves or wetlands or coral reefs around a coastal community. And the other cool thing about EBA is that they do this thing that we scientists, especially we conservation biologists, like, and that's that they protect biodiversity and ecosystem services. So instead of ripping out plants and creating a seawall or a levee, if we preserve mangroves, that is important nursery habitat for commercially important fish, and also provides a whole host of things like cleaning water, etc. So for this project, I was interested in calculating where coastal communities, human communities, were most vulnerable to climate change. And to do that, we used the IPCC's sort of standard way of calculating vulnerability, which is to calculate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And specifically, we were interested in coastal communities. And so the two exposures we wanted to map were sea level rise and tropical storms. So sea level rise is fairly easy. We have good maps of what sea level rise is going to look like in the future. So we used a 1 meter sea level rise. And then tropical storms are a little harder. There isn't good information about how those will change with time. So we assumed that any place that had tropical storms in the past would continue to have them and continue to have them more severely into the future. So that doesn't account for how sensitive people are to those climate change exposures. And so that's what the sensitivity layer is about. So we created a geospatial map that calculated how dense human communities were, how close to the coast they were, and what their elevation was. So the highest sensitivity communities had dense populations, they lived really close to the coast, and they had low elevations. And then lastly, adaptive capacity is a really important socioeconomic type of indicator that tells us basically how able is a government or a people able to buy their way out of climate change trouble. And so for this, we amalgamated a bunch of different indicators, including governance, infrastructure, income, access to markets, health services, and education, all into one adaptive capacity layer. And the idea here is that the most vulnerable communities have low adaptive capacity. They can't buy their way out of trouble. They're densely populated, and they are getting a fair amount of sea level rise and tropical storms. So there's a lot of stuff that went into the map I'm about to produce, or I'm about to show you, but we're going to skip over all those details, and I'm just going to show you the map of where ecosystems are that can help people adapt to climate change. So the first thing we did was calculate the vulnerability of all the coastal communities in the world. And then we asked, okay, where are mangroves and coral reefs intersecting those communities with a big enough acreage to where they would actually confer some sort of protective forces, like absorbing storm surges and dampening out wind effects. And here is what we found. This just came out like 2 weeks ago, so I'm very excited to have it off my desk and into the world. So you can see here that obviously we're looking at the tropical areas because that's where coral reefs and mangroves are. And we found over 10 million hectares of mangroves and coral reefs protect 8.6 million highly vulnerable people. So this paper was all about identifying the really hot spots of vulnerability, so the top 10th percentile of vulnerable people, and then overlaying where mangroves and coral reefs are. So some of the hottest spots or most vulnerable places are Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Honduras, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And then we also did a benefit of how much carbon then was stored in the mangroves, particularly in these places that have highly vulnerable communities. And we find it's a lot. It's about 10% or so of the global carbon dioxide emissions. the equivalent of 10% of that is stored long-term in the mangroves that are already protecting people from climate change, coastal climate change. And so this underscores that these solutions can be a win-win-win. They can be a win for people, they can be a win for nature, and they can be a win for climate change mitigation even. So that's super important. And these types of global analyses are really important because they give us a sense of where people are most vulnerable to things like sea level rise and storms. They also identify that there's this big potential benefit for coastal ecosystems to give these benefits. And then this is also really important for adaptation planners. So government officials and other people who are interested in trying to figure out or grapple with how to deal with climate change, these types of analyses are really important to sort of focus on the fact that ecosystems can give these benefits beyond just hard engineered solutions, which most developing countries can't afford anyway. And so that's why these types of solutions are really important. Okay, I'm going to switch gears to the global meta-analysis of ecosystem recovery. Some colleagues and I did a couple of years back. I sort of alluded to the fact that I've been doing these global analyses for a little while now. And this was something that I naively came up with when I was a PhD student. I thought, you know, no one's actually done, you know, looked at where everyone's done restoration and how ecosystems have recovered, and why not? And then it took me 5 years to do this project, and I figured out why not. And it's because it was a ton of work. And there's a lot of sort of nuances that one can't capture in these big global analyses, which I'm just gonna, you know, recognize at the outset here. Okay, so for this analysis, the team that I worked with and I were really interested in understanding where ecosystems had recovered or what the process of ecosystem recovery in these ecosystems look like from large-scale disturbances, things like those things that are pictured here. So the agriculture, recovery from eutrophication. So that's the big dead zone off of the Gulf of Mexico, off of Louisiana at the bottom of the Mississippi River here in the States. After logging, after dams, so that's the Hoover Dam, after oil spills, and after mining. So we were really interested in understanding recovery after these like big scale disturbances. And so to do this, we searched the literature and we searched these terms and those various disturbances that I told you about. And after searching through, like, I don't know how many papers came up, maybe 2,000 or something like that, we found 400 studies that had measured over 5,000 different response variables, which in of itself is an interesting finding. So people are measuring a ton of different things to gauge how ecosystems are responding to disturbance. And then what we did was we used two different metrics to indicate how recovery was proceeding, response ratio and recovery rate. So response ratio is how close to recovery an actual response variable is. And so for studies to be included in this project, they had to have a measure of, they had to have a goal, a restoration goal. And I am not shocked anymore, but you might be shocked how many papers I had to throw out because there was no goal. It was just about how things responded after a disturbance, but it didn't say what the goal was at all. So we had to throw quite a lot out. But anyway, response ratio is how close to that goal a response variable is, and then recovery rate is just like it sounds. So how fast towards recovery are these response variables going? So I did a little word cloud of the different response variables that people measure, just to give you a sense of sort of what people are measuring. And the bigger the word is, the more often it was measured. So you can see that abundance was the most commonly measured thing, as you might imagine. It's one of the easiest things to measure, and potentially one of the most important. But you can see there are a whole host of different things in here that people measured. And it was really hard to put them all into categories that made biological sense, as you might imagine. Okay, so the goal of this, overarching goal of this research project was to ask, can ecosystems completely recover, and does actively restoring them help? And what I mean by actively restoring them is after the disturbance ends, doing something else. So the act of just ending a disturbance is in and of itself often very labor intensive. So imagine sort of reconnecting hydrology in a wetland, for example, requires a lot of like moving around of the earth. But that we considered passive recovery because it's basically just getting rid of the disturbance, whereas planting vegetation or restoring a species or altering the chemicals, like actively putting chemicals in a waterway, those things might be active restoration. Okay, so before I populate this with data, I just want to walk you through what you're seeing. So these are the exact same data categorized on the left as the disturbance type and on the right as the ecosystem type. And I'm about to show you the response ratios. And that's what the x-axis is, it's recovery completeness. So if the data overlap that dotted line, that means full recovery for these ecosystems. And if it's lower, if it's negative, that means that that recovery has not yet been fully achieved. And if it were positive, that would mean recovery was achieved beyond what the goal was. So you can see the big disturbances that we had here. The multiple categories, multiple interacting of those disturbances, as you might have gathered. Okay, so here's what the data show. In the red, we have passively recovering ecosystems, and in the blue, we have actively restored ecosystems. And the first thing and the gray bars are just both of those put together. So whether or not it was restored, the gray bars indicate that. And then the numbers are the numbers of response variables on the left-hand side, and in parentheses, the number of studies that went into each one of these to give you just a sense of how much data is actually going into these data points. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that none of these are crossing the dashed line, meaning full recovery has not happened for any of these variables on average across all these globally. And then they're ordered by the closest to recovery from the farthest to recovery. So if you just look at disturbances, the closest to full recovery are after logging disturbances, and the furthest away is after eutrophication. And eutrophication is this thing where it's often very hard to just end the disturbance of eutrophication. It's more often just sort of controlling it. So I think that has something to do with why it's so far away from full recovery. And also, you know, lakes are often eutrophied, so that's probably why they're the furthest from recovery. So the other thing to notice is that active restoration doesn't look like it's helping for this metric. In other words, the blue bars aren't any closer to full recovery than the red bars are. And that, as a restoration ecologist, sort of hurts. And part of the reason why this took 5 years is because we had to reanalyze the data like 17 ways because I almost didn't believe it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more on the next slide about why I think this might be. But the same pattern holds true for the other metric I was talking about, which is recovery rate. So the recovery is not faster for restored ecosystems than it is for passively recovering ecosystems. Yeah, so that's just what I said. Ecosystems aren't recovered completely, and restoration does not seem to help. Okay, so some implications of this work are that conservation of undamaged systems really remains critical. So if these ecosystems aren't recovering or these variables aren't recovering, regardless of whether we actively restore or not, that means undamaged systems are really important to continue to conserve because they're likely to give us the most biodiversity and ecosystem services. I also just want to point out that ecosystem mitigation strategies are unlikely to work. So here in the States, we have this wetland mitigation bank situation where if you're a developer and you want to develop on a wetland, you can do that, but you have to go build a wetland somewhere else to make up for the area that you've built on. Now, what the data that I just showed you suggests is that ecosystems can't recover completely. So you're not getting a one-to-one trade-off for these ecosystem mitigation strategies. I also want to point out that restoration, again, is still in its infancy, and I think we need to do a lot more work to identify which strategies are most effective. So just because none of those blue bars were farther than the red, or just because restoration didn't speed up or exact more complete recovery, doesn't mean restoration never works. It just means that when you look at a big global scale and you push everything together, it looks like it's not helping compared to just letting ecosystems recover on their own. So there's plenty of very effective restoration case studies out there. It's just that on the whole, the data are showing that that restoration is not helping globally. I also want to point out that our team did a economic analysis of how much biodiversity and ecosystem function is lost while ecosystems recover. And the TLDR of that is that it's a lot. And so just not disturbing ecosystems is super important, and trying to get them to recover as fast as we can is also important. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna change gears now to island recovery from invasive mammal removal, which is sort of the longest part of my talk. And that's because I've been working on island ecosystems since I was an undergraduate in college, and they've been my passion for a really long time. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the work my collaborators in lab and I have been doing looking at island responses to invasive mammal removal. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but I talked earlier about how islands have a disproportionate amount of extinctions. And it turns out the things that cause those disproportionate amount of extinctions are invasive mammals, like rats and cats and other predators, but also herbivores as well. So one or more of these species has been introduced to around 90% of the world's island archipelagos, and that's resulted in some devastating impacts to all trophic members of island food webs, including plants, invertebrates, reptiles, land birds, and seabirds. And a keen observer should really be asking why. So like, why are island species so vulnerable to extinction? Why is conservation really important on islands? And to demonstrate this why, I like to blow up the seabird picture here. So that is a lovely Laysan albatross, and next to it is the smallest species of invasive rat on islands, the Pacific rat, or Kiori. So it's about a 65-gram rat, and that's about a 3-kilogram bird there. And the thing about these birds is that they've evolved without predators. And so they don't have the evolved defense mechanisms to protect themselves from predators like rats, cats, etc. when those predators are introduced to the islands. Instead, this bird is sort of genetically programmed to incubate its egg at all costs because it reproduces infrequently and often only has one chick. And so in order to pass its genetics on to the next generation, it really needs to incubate that egg. So you can imagine that bird just tearing that rat apart. That's not what they end up doing. In fact, on one of the study islands that I work on, Midway Atoll, with a master's student in my lab, Vitica, the mice have started chewing through the heads of Laysan albatross and other species of albatross, which is just wild. And there are some great photos in National Geographic of that. I decided to leave them out of this presentation just in case anyone's squeamish in the morning, but if it was an evening presentation, I'd give it to you. But anyway, that's why island species are so vulnerable to predation and to invasive species, because they haven't evolved the protective mechanisms that their continental counterparts have. And seabirds in particular, and the predation of them is especially important on many islands, and especially on the islands that I work on. And that's because seabirds are really these ecosystem engineers. So we know that seabirds, true to their name, spend most of their lives on the open ocean, and they're top predators in the ocean. They're very important. They take out as much fish as we take out globally for our fishing industry. But the thing that they do for islands is that they have to breed there. So they're sort of obligate land breeders, and they have to come ashore to nest, and they often pick islands that are relatively isolated to do that. And when they do that, they have these important impacts. Because they are top predators in the marine environment, they feed on fish and other ocean creatures that are really enriched in nitrogen. And then they come and deposit these beautiful nitrogen packets in the form of guano. And because seabirds are colonial animals, they can often breed in the thousands to the millions. You heard what it sounds like on some of my study islands. And that nutrient source is super duper important for the biodiversity on islands. So seabirds do important things on islands, including dispersing seeds. The burrowing seabirds engineer the soil, they churn it up. And then the nutrient subsidy is especially what my lab has been studying in terms of its impacts on island communities. So seabird islands are so unique that they have their own book called Seabird Islands. Y'all should check it out. But those ecosystems are so unique because seabirds really drive them. Because they're ecosystem engineers, the biodiversity on those islands really relies on that input from seabirds. And that means when those invasive mammals get onto these islands and destroy seabird populations and other species, there are huge seismic shifts in these food webs. So we know that invasive mammal introduction to these islands is really bad. It can result in extinctions. But the good news is that mammals can be removed. And so what I've really been interested in, again, ever since I was an undergrad, is trying to figure out then what happens. Because a lot of work in this island conservation field is just about how we get rid of the mammals. And while that's really, really important, I was really interested in trying to understand what happens afterwards. Can we track recovery? Can we speed it up? Do we need to speed it up, etc.? Okay, so again, another one of these global analyses that a team and I did. We did a few years ago now in 2016, where we asked, okay, so we've been removing invasive mammals since about the 1970s or so. How has that removal impacted native island animals? And it turns out it's been a huge benefit. So around 800 populations of over 300 species on over 200 islands have documented or are predicted to benefit from invasive mammal eradication. And so this map shows those different populations. The size of the dot indicates the number of populations. And so what demonstrated means in the green is that we have measured a recovery, a population recovery. Maybe it was a population was reintroduced, maybe a population recolonized. What predicted means is that there is a critically endangered, or vulnerable seabird species on that island, and there was an eradication on that island. So we would predict that that seabird benefited from that eradication, even though we don't have an actual measured response. And that's important because these islands are very isolated and it's super hard to study them, and it's super hard to study seabirds as well. So the beneficiaries abound. Here are just a few of my favorites. And we categorize these beneficiaries in various ways. So I wanted to show you specifically the reintroduced species. And then while normally as a good scientist, I hate pie charts, this is a good place for a pie chart because it gives you a sense of how these reintroduced species are laid out by taxa. And I just want to note for you seabird heads out there, there are only 8 seabird species that were reintroduced after an invasive mammal eradication back in those days, which is wildly under what there should be, given that we've been restoring seabirds for a while and have the methods down decently well. So I also just want to point out that not only are species recovering, but those that were once thought extinct are being rediscovered. So some of you will probably be familiar with the New Zealand storm petrel. So they reappeared flying around one of the study islands that I work on, Hotaru, after rats and cats were eradicated. We thought the species was extinct for almost 100 years. And then all of a sudden we removed the mammals, and some collaborators of mine just saw New Zealand storm petrels flying around. And one of the coolest field experiences I've ever had is when I was on this island and they were banding New Zealand storm petrels, and super cool. All seabirds are attracted to light. So if you're on a seabird island, they'll fly right into your head if you have a head torch on. So how they attract them to band them is just with these huge torches. And so you just sort of, you lay down, you have your light off, and then when they fly over, you spotlight them and you try to get them sort of confused in the light, and they fly right on down. And you can band them. It was one of the most spiritual moments I've ever had, was banding these guys on Little Barrier just a few years after they were rediscovered. It was really cool. Okay, so that's the top level, here's what's happening globally with the responses. But I'm also a really big science nerd, so I really want to know what's happening on the ground, especially with ecosystem functioning. So this next part of the talk addresses that. So how island ecosystems actually recover following invasive mammal removal. So this is one of those papers that Justine was alluding to, where in my PhD, I looked at islands that had had different times to recover since rodent eradication in New Zealand. And so I used those as treatments in a natural experiment to look at how recovery happened with time. And then I had a bunch of islands that had never been invaded, and that was my sort of restoration goal. And then I had some that were invaded, which are like a positive control, so the point from which restoration begins, assumedly. So all these are on the northeastern part of the North Island of New Zealand. And so globally, all done up, we had islands, or I had islands that had 12 to 22 years to recover after eradication. And you may think that's short, but I'll just remind everybody that we just started eradicating things from islands in the 80s. And so at the time I did this study, this was the longest time since eradication chronosequence that we'd ever had. And that's part of the reason why I chose to study in New Zealand, because they're the pioneers of this eradication technology. So they have this good long history of eradication that I could use as a treatment in a natural experiment. Okay, so to look at recovery, what I wanted to do was understand how much seabird influence in island food webs there was. And so to do this, I used stable isotope analysis. And for those of you who aren't familiar with stable isotope analysis for these purposes, let me just give you a little primer here. So the stable isotopes of nitrogen on Earth come in two forms, 15 nitrogen and 14 nitrogen. They differ in their mass by 1 neutron, hence the name 15 and 14. And the thing about marine food chains compared to terrestrial food chains is that marine food chains are longer. And so what that means in terms of nitrogen isotopes is that marine food chains are more enriched in the heavier form of nitrogen, 15 nitrogen, than 14 nitrogen. Whereas terrestrial ecosystems are dominated by 14 nitrogen. And the cool thing about seabirds is they eat in the marine environment, but they breed on islands. And so they basically deposit this 15 nitrogen rich guano onto islands. And therefore we can use stable isotopes in things like soils and plants and spiders to understand how much seabirds are influencing the ecosystems on the study islands that I work on. Which is a long way of saying when you see high delta 15N values in my next slide, think lots and lots and lots of fairy brands. Okay, so same thing, I'm just gonna set the graph up for you before I populate it with data. So we have 3 different trophic levels, soils, plants, and spiders. And then we have delta 15 nitrogen, which again is about seabird influence. So the higher the value, the more seabird influence. And then we have invaded islands, which is where restoration begins. We have eradicated new islands, meaning these islands were eradicated within the last 15 years. We have islands that have been eradicated over 15 years, and then we have the never invaded or goal islands. And here is what we found. So these islands that are a little less than 400 hectares, so smallish islands, recover pretty quickly. So if you look at the eradicated new and the eradicated old, they're pretty similar already to the never invaded values, even 15 to 22 years post-recovery. And so that's really exciting news, but the next sort of step in this research was about looking at bigger islands and at different islands. So I had a master's student, her name was Steph Kong, and she was really curious about what was going on in these bigger islands. So she worked on Hotaru, which is where that New Zealand storm petrel was discovered. This is what it looks like. It's super cool, it's big. And it's got this cloud forest, so it's got major topography. And Steph went out there and collected soil and spiders and plants from this island to try to see how it was recovering after cats and rats were eradicated. And at the time that she collected these samples, this island had about 10 to 15 years to recover after these things were eradicated, but the seabirds were really dense. So she was collecting soils, plants, and spiders from these really dense seabird colonies on Hotaru. And here's what she found. So even though Hotaru has had quite a few years to recover, it looks as if it's functioning as an invaded island. So you can see its levels of delta 15N are very low. And again, so in terms of the seabird density on this island, it's actually higher seabird density than the never invaded control islands, about 1 burrow per square meter compared to 0.63 for our never invaded islands. So we found that interesting, certainly, but this is sort of one island, and there could be a whole host of things going on with nitrogen mineralization and nitrification in the soils that are driving this. But it seems as if the sort of most parsimonious explanation for what's going on here is that Hotaru's big, and perhaps there's this island-sized threshold beyond which seabird islands aren't seabird islands anymore. Instead, something else is driving the nutrient cycling on these islands. And that's where the PhD student that Justine and I co-advised, Penny Pascoe's project, comes in. So I had applied for some National Geographic funding to look at, so we have islands that are 400 hectares and one island that's 3,000 hectares. And we really need to fill in the gap of the size to understand if there is actually an island size threshold beyond which seabird islands aren't seabird islands anymore. But it's also interesting to think about how the different types of ecosystems might behave differently. So I was studying in temperate islands, but do subantarctics behave the same way, and do tropical islands behave the same way? So I put in a grant to look at this all over the globe, and National Geographic said, that's cute, but maybe you should just start with New Zealand and Australia and then go big after that. So Penny's project is really cool, and part of it is sort of filling in this island size gap, and she's working in the subantarctics, and hopefully we'll be able to get to New Zealand at some point to do more field work on different study islands that vary in their time since eradication, but also in their area, so that we can look at this question a little bit more closely. So stay tuned for Penny's work. Okay, now I'm gonna like switch gears real hard and talk to you about these prairie responses to restoration that I've been doing since I moved to Illinois. So as I said earlier, when you move to Illinois and you work in restoration and you want a local field site to, bring undergraduates and engage students that don't necessarily or aren't able to travel internationally, you work on prairies, and here is why. I have a lot of, different photos of the field site, but this is one of my favorite ones. So I'm not gonna jump over it. I'm gonna let you all see it for a minute. Okay, and then I'm gonna show you a map. So I work in a very particular type of prairie called the tallgrass prairie. And what that means is that we're in the part of the prairie ecosystem that gets a fair amount of rain or precipitation. And so that means the grasses that grow in this area are tall. Like, I'm not tall, but it's 3 feet above me or a meter above me, basically. So these plants are really tall, especially in August. And it's also, one of the most endangered ecosystems. So this map shows the historical extent in the lighter color and then what's left in the green. I don't have a pointer, so I'm gonna just describe Illinois to you. So there, you see the Great Lakes. There's one big Great Lake that looks like a finger. It's pointing at Illinois, which is mostly covered in the historical extent. I gave this talk to the British Ecological Society, and someone gave me the business for assuming people knew where Illinois was. So there it is. I apologize if you all already know. So Illinois, ironically, is called the Prairie State, but you can see it doesn't even make the map in terms of what prairie is left. In fact, we've lost 99.99% of our prairies in Illinois, mostly to growing corn and beans to feed to animals. And also to development, for example, the Chicagoland area. So that's a bummer, but underneath the star is one project where people are really trying to change all that. Specifically, the place I work is called Nachusa Grasslands, and it was founded in 1986. And the story of its founding is really cool. This conservationist husband and wife team drove by and heard the call of the upland sandpiper out their window when they were driving by a bunch of corn and beans, which is bizarre because an upland sandpiper does not hang out in corn and beans. It, in fact, only hangs out in prairie. And so they jumped out of their car, bushwhacked through the corn and beans, and found this wonderful remnant that's actually pictured here. It's that knob where the bison are right in front of. And they thought there are really cool prairie plants here and it should be restored. And so they knew some people at the Nature Conservancy who own and operate Nachusa. And they were like, we should really restore this piece of land. And so about 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the place that's now the core of Nachusa Grasslands was about to be sold for a housing development with street names like Big Blue Stem and Little Blue Stem, which are 2 prairie grasses, TNC bought the whole thing up and started Nachusa Grasslands, which is amazing. So back then, their goal was a relatively revolutionary one. It was the idea of connecting these remnants that had never been plowed before, that's what a remnant means, to each other so that there was flow, gene flow and other types of flow with restored prairie at the big landscape scale. And they've been doing that and buying up plots of land ever since 1986 and restoring them. And it's a lot of work to restore a prairie. It starts with farm field, with corn or beans like this. And then the fall after harvest that they want to restore a place, they'll revegetate it. So this is a crew of volunteers. Nachusa is really unique in that they have about 13 full-time employees worth of volunteer hours out there, which is amazing. So these are volunteers mixing seeds. They plant around 150 to 200 prairie species in around November, right before the freeze-thaw cycle happens throughout the winter. And then they're not done after that, right? They have to maintain the prairie. And so they do things like control invasive species to do that, but they also mimic historical disturbance regimes. So indigenous Native American communities used to set fire to the prairie to make it easier to live and hunt. And then natural fires would have been set by the thunderstorms that I was talking about briefly. But now managers set prescribed fire to the landscape. And it's really important because we get so much precipitation here that if we didn't have fire, we would have forest. And so it's a really important way to control woody plants, but also invasive plants. But the thing about fire is that it gives the competitive advantage to grasses in this system. And grasses are competitively dominant over the wildflowers that bring all the prairie diversity. And so the problem with grasses dominating is that you lose plant diversity and you lose habitat heterogeneity as well. So to control the grass and give the advantage back to the wildflowers, another historical disturbance regime was just reintroduced in 2014 at my study site, that of bison grazing. So that little tiny photo is that guy on top, that is a man on top of a mountain of bison skulls, just to show that we almost drove bison to extinction in the late 1800s, mostly to get rid of indigenous people's foods so that we could control the land. But bison are a conservation success story. We put some in captivity and reintroduced them mostly out to the west in like Yellowstone and Yosemite and those places. But bison were reintroduced at Nachusa in 2014. And this was the first time bison were reintroduced east of the Mississippi River. So it was a very big deal. One of the first bison reintroductions to tallgrass prairie. And again, the job of bison from a manager's perspective is to eat that grass and give that competitive advantage back to the forbs. But the problem is we don't know a whole lot about how these reintroduced bison are going to impact plant communities, small mammal communities, birds, soil microbes, really anything. And so when I heard that they were getting ready to reintroduce bison there, when I first started out here in Illinois in 2012, I immediately called up all my friends so that we could get before data, because that's what a good scientist does. So I don't study everything listed here, but some of my collaborators and I study it together. So we have an expert in invertebrates, we have people studying bees, the soil microbial community, and then my lab studying plants, small mammals, and birds as well. And I would love to tell you all about what we're studying, but I don't have enough time. So instead, I'm going to give you this beautiful map of our sites that we collected with drone imagery. And I'm just going to show you that this is like a restoration ecologist playground, because it has different plots of land that have different times since restoration. So you have this wonderful chronosequence of land that's been restored from 2001 all the way up to as recent as 2013 in the bison unit, which is in brown, and then outside the bison unit in green. So they really set it up perfectly for another natural experiment, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to understand how bison and fire and time since restoration are all interacting to change these prairie food webs, and how managers are doing, how managers may want to use this information to sort of alter their management practices. So that's pretty fun. I'm just going to tell you what we found so far. I used isotopes to study bison diet, and what's cool is they don't actually just eat grass. They eat a whole host of other stuff, including legumes and nitrogen-fixing forbs. And we see their diet shift seasonally, and they really love wetland plants in the fall and winter. So we're looking more into the wetland ecosystem to see how that's impacted. We see higher decomposition of dung and higher abundance and richness of dung beetles in the bison unit, as one might expect, but it's pretty cool to see it. We see increased nesting success of grassland birds, which was a little bit surprising, but that only lasts for the first 2 years and then it sort of evens out. And then we find heavier small mammals and a change in their predation risk as bison are reintroduced. So we think bison are eating those grasses down, and then small mammals don't have the cover of those grasses to go out and forage and hide from owls and other nocturnal predators. So they're changing their predation risk, which is a really cool sort of behavioral impact that we're studying more. And so I just want to end with, the talk promised, the prognosis for if we can restore damaged ecosystems. And I would say the reintroduction of this mega herbivore in this new place, which is changing ecosystems how we expected and how we didn't expect it, would suggest, yeah, I mean, we can. And then all of these bird species which recolonized or newly colonized islands after invasive mammals were removed also suggests that we can. And so I don't want anyone to be, unhopeful by the meta-analysis. I think it's important that we use hope where we can, and I think we can restore damaged ecosystems if we try. Lastly, the work I've just showed you is totally a team work. The engines of the research in my lab and probably in all of yours are the students and collaborators that I work with. So here are many of them. I also want to point out that the work that I do is very applied. So I work with practitioners and managers to try to select research questions that matter to them and that will be useful to them. And if your work is similar, if it has really important practical implications, British Ecological Society has a new journal called Ecological Solutions and Evidence, of which I am the lead editor. And I encourage you all to check it out and potentially submit your research there if it has any management or practical implications. And or if you are a manager, if you work with managers, we have particular journal types that are for managers written by managers. Okay, thank you for your time and my questions.
Thanks so much,